But according to Ingo Swann, that is not what they had him do. They wanted him to look at the dark side of the moon. So he wakes up. Axelrod tells him that his target would be the moon. And Swann was, completely confused. He's like, what? And Axelrod made it clear from the beginning, hey, you're not asking questions. We're just giving you coordinates and you got to go look at it. So Swann's job was to observe and report, not to understand what they were doing or why. So Swann was given a list of specific coordinates on the moon and told to go through them systematically, one by one. And they're not random locations either. Someone had carefully selected these coordinates for some specific reason, but Swann wasn't told what those reasons might be. So he settles into his chair, begins his process of projecting his consciousness towards the first set of coordinates, and Swann expected to see what, you would see in, the Apollo astronaut footage or something like that, right? Like a barren, airless world covered in craters and dust and rocks. And the first few locations kind of matched his expectations perfectly, right? He described everything from, crater floors to fields of boulders and pretty much just standard stuff that, an astronomer would tell you, or, if you'd seen, the moon landing footage, you'd be like, yeah, that's basically what I saw. But as Swann moved through more coordinates, he started to notice things that didn't really make sense. So, for instance, he began describing what looked like tracks on the surface of the moon, and not the kind of tracks left by like the lunar rovers, which were pretty small and limited to specific areas. He sees like extensive track patterns that suggest heavy machinery had been operating across large sections of the lunar surface. He also reported seeing patterns on the surface that look like they had been created by like wind. But everyone, knows that the moon has no atmosphere. There's no wind, which would mean there's no wind patterns or erosion. So, according to Swann, he says that that's what he saw. And at this point, it's not really making sense to him. In fact, as he continued his survey of the coordinates, Swann began to get this distinct impression that there was some type of atmosphere in the areas that he was viewing. Not like a thick atmosphere like Earth's, but like definitely something more than just the perfect vacuum that scientists, say that surround the moon. So Swann then encounters something that makes him kind of stop and think. When he moves his consciousness into one specific crater, he finds himself surrounded by like this greenish like haze, like a fog almost, like, something that you would see almost like in like a spooky movie. Like it's just weird. He's just like in this crater and he's seeing like this fog. And then somewhere within the haze, there's like this thing generating light that's casting light, like a green light across this whole fog. And this is, at this point, he's just like, what? Where am I? Like, he's like, am I even on the moon right now? This makes no sense. Like, why am I looking at this? And this is where things take a turn for the weird. Swann notes, according to his own book, that the light he was seeing was diffused rather than sharp. And, harsh lighting you would expect, like on the moon, right? And in this sort of airless, atmosphereless world, the light travels in straight lines with no scattering, which creates a major difference between bright areas and these deep shadows. But diffused light requires an atmosphere to actually like scatter the photons and like soften it, right? So if Swann was seeing diffused light on the moon, something was scattering the light. This wasn't making any sense to him. So he starts moving closer to investigate the light, and he describes seeing what looked like an airport or something, and like not like a natural formation, but like clearly like artificial structures that reminded him of like these like landing strips and like almost like a military base. He saw these large buildings that look like aircraft hangars and roads and connecting different areas and different towers of different heights and like heavy machinery. And it didn't make any sense to him what he was looking at, but he continued his remote viewing of the area. And he found that this wasn't just like an isolated installation. There were roads that appeared to be connected to bridges spanning between craters and connecting different parts of what seemed to be this extensive infrastructure network. And throughout this massive complex that he's now observing, he says that he saw evidence of industrial activity, cuts into like the rock faces that were, perfectly round, that looked like they had been drilled by like giant, earth moving equipment and machinery. And these weren't like natural caves or craters. They were just like precisely engineered like excavations that suggested that someone was mining or like taking materials from the surface of the moon. This whole thing, even for Ingo Swann, was pretty strange. And so when he moves to a different set of coordinates, Swann encountered structures that were emitting different colors of lights. And these lights weren't like the usual harsh single colors that you would expect from like machines. They almost had like this organic feeling, shifting between colors that seemed to serve like almost a communication or like operational purpose. But some of the strangest structures were a series of these dome-shaped buildings that appeared to have windows. And he sees these windows and he goes towards the windows. Like his consciousness is now moving towards them. And despite all of the darkness on the moon, Swann could see what he described as a fine mist inside the structures, along with that same sort of green kind of like light emitting through it. And remember, Swann had been trained to observe and report without embellishment. And his success in all of his previous experiments had come from this exact ability to just basically be like, this is what I saw, this is what happened, done. Verifiable details rather than like vague impressions. So when he reported seeing windows and atmospheric effects inside these lunar structures, he was describing these things, according to him, as precisely as he could. But what he saw next would fundamentally change the limits of any type of scientific credibility. He looks more closely at the windows and starts to actually look into the windows. And as he's like basically right up to the window with his consciousness looking inside this thing on the moon, which again, I know sounds crazy, but this is what he says. He starts to make out these human type beings moving around inside. And he described them as looking almost human, but not exactly. Like their basic proportions and like their movements were generally human, but he couldn't make out exactly what they were or what they were doing through the window. But what he could see was that there was an area of like high activity. These beings or whatever they were very busy and they were doing some type of work or operation. And Swann characterized the overall scene as an active like research facility or something with beings moving purposefully between different areas, operating equipment and engaging what looked like coordinated activities. And this wasn't like a dead installation or like an outpost. Whatever was happening right now. And Swann continued to observe, trying to gather as many details as possible for his report. And something that he saw sent a chill through the entire facility, not only on the moon, but back in America as well. The beings all of a sudden just stopped what they were doing. And they turned toward the window where Swann was viewing them from. And they just became aware that he was there. They immediately became aware that they were being watched by something or someone, and they just stopped. And Swann immediately felt like a wave of nervousness wash over him. This has never happened to him before in his viewing experience, that he's viewing something that then views him back. And these beings weren't just randomly looking in his direction. They were aware of him, even though he was hundreds of thousands of miles away on Earth. But he knew that they were observing him and he was observing them. So then he tells Axelrod, the guy that's actually conducting the experiment, that's sitting in the room with him physically, he says to him, "They see me." And Axelrod instantly tells Swann, "Come back." But the situation kind of continues to escalate. Swann watched as more beings gathered in the windows and they began doing something horrifying. They started to point at him right through the window in which Swann was watching them with his consciousness. And they knew exactly where he was, even though his physical body was sitting in a chair at a secret facility on Earth. Axelrod vehemently tells Swann, "Get out of there, come back." And the urgency in his voice suggested that this wasn't just like, it wasn't like he didn't know what was happening. This didn't seem like an unexpected development. It was legit. This was dangerous. Whatever protocol existed for this type of remote viewing mission, Swann had apparently triggered some kind of security concern that required immediate action. So Swann forced his consciousness to disengage, and just like that, he's back in the chair and he's slowly opening his eyes and readjusting to his physical surroundings, kind of looking around. And he finds Axelrod looking at him with this expression of like concern that kind of was like, what did you just see? But also confirmation that, that he had already encountered something that he sort of expected. And Swann basically turned to Axelrod and just asked him, "You already know they're psychic, don't you?" And Axelrod basically just looked back at him and said, "That's all for today. Get some rest." So Ingo goes to sleep, and the whole time he's just thinking, like, what did I just see? Like, what was that? Was that like a test? Did they dose me with drugs? Was I on LSD? Like, what just happened? And like, what kind of beings would sense that they were being observed from hundreds of thousands of miles away? Was it possible that the U.S. intelligence agencies like came across something that was more complicated or interdimensional? And if Swann's observations are correct, it suggests that there's, some type of active extraterrestrial presence, which is just insane, right? Like not only just like that, type of claim, but the idea that these things were also psychic, or maybe this was a different timeline, or who knows what exactly happened. But this is according to Ingo Swann, what he wrote down and what he saw. So for an agency like the CIA, which relies on gathering intelligence without being noticed, this poses an interesting challenge. They aren't just facing the possibility of extraterrestrial life, they're facing the possibility of extraterrestrials that could also watch them back.